So in this second half of the course, we're going to be looking at a little bit different content than in the first half of the course. We're going to be looking at some things as we have that are kind of explicit ways to advance your creative problem solving. But we're going to be looking at many more instances of implicit ways that you advance your skills in creative problem solving. So in the first half of the course, we looked at a lot of just techniques, things you can do to be better at creative problem solving. So things like the 4-step method. So research, get to know the problem, understand all the aspects of it, really get deeply into what are the facts and what is the data here. That's the first step. Second step, incubation, then stepping back from the problem a little bit, letting it roll over in your head, giving some time to imagine, explore. And then the third step is elimination. Then kind of forcing that moment where you think, okay, what does that mean? Where does this go? Some people would say the aha moment. That's what it is. That's the solution to this problem. So that aha moment, the elimination. And then the fourth step is evaluation. Okay, does this really work? Do I need to modify it somewhat? Do I need to go back through this process over again? This is an explicit tool for how you do creative problem solving. Another example of that is we've talked about this triptych of values, vision, design. So if you're approaching a problem, it's an indeterminate problem. The answer is not inherent in that problem. You realize you're going to have to bring something to that problem. A good thing to do is to think, well, what values can I bring to this problem? What do I believe in? What do I think? How can I inject myself into this problem? So you think through values, and then from those values, combined with the facts of the problem, you then have a vision. You imagine, where does this go? What are the possibilities here? And you envision a future. And then the third step is design. Then how do I get there? What do I do? This is, again, another kind of explicit process for creative problem solving. So these are super important in creative problems, these explicit techniques. But equally important are these implicit capabilities you build into yourself. And these are things like, Richard Florida talked about in terms of leading an experiential life. M.I.T talked about these creative dualities. These are inherent things you're building into your personality, who you are, how you think, how you make your mind a creative mind. So these are more implicit capabilities. And I've mentioned before this fantastic book called Incognito by David Eagleman. This is about the unconscious part of your brain. Very important part of your brain for creative problem solving. Part of your brain is your conscious brain. Part of the brain is your unconscious brain, where you're not necessarily explicitly utilizing that part of the brain. You're not controlling where it's going, but you have an unconscious brain in there that is leading you in a certain direction. And how we train that unconscious brain, how we wire that unconscious brain to be creative is super important. So that's something that Incognito is a lot about. There's another book called Subliminal. Neither of these books has a chapter I can really have you read that sort of sums it all up. But they're both really fundamental to the thinking behind this course. So all of this is about implicitly shaping your brain for creativity. And it has to do with something we're going to talk about very thoroughly a couple of talks from now when we'll be looking at neuroplasticity. how our brain actually can be shaped to get some of these unconscious or implicit capabilities, or not get those capabilities. And a lot of what we're going to be interested in the second half of the course is how do we shape our brain to give it those implicit capabilities. Several talks ago, we were discussing what we referred to as historical perspective on different ages where human beings focused on different capabilities. And I would posit that in each of those ages, we as human beings shaped our brain to have certain capabilities that enabled us to move into that more advanced stage. And it's because we have this malleable brain. We have this brain that changes itself, that has neuroplasticity. So if you can imagine way back in the agricultural age, the human brain was a very different thing than what we have right now. Not just by evolution, and it actually isn't about evolution. It's actually about taking the same raw material, but utilizing it in a very, very different way. So imagine you're in the agricultural age and you live on a subsistence farm, and your experience of the world is just literally what you see every day. So your world is the farm, and you have never been anywhere else. No one you know has ever been anywhere else. Your life, your family's life for generations has been on this farm. And actually, you don't even know what's on the other side of the mountains over there. No one's really been there. You have a brain that thinks very literally, and it's really attuned to just your needs immediately on that farm. Now, in order to move to the mercantile age from the agricultural age, there had to be new brain capabilities. And the new brain capabilities were enhanced to some extent by some technological inventions that came along. So for one thing, human beings developed the map. And the map was an abstract way of thinking. Instead of a literal way of thinking, my world is what I can see every day. I now have to think abstractly. There might be something outside my literal world. There might be something on the other side of that mountain. And I can see a map that shows my location and that mountain. And then over on the other side, there's a river. And then down the river, there's the ocean. And I can begin to understand a bigger world and to think in a different way, to think abstractly about space in a different way. Now, that was really important to move to a mercantile age, because in a mercantile age, you said, okay, on my farm, I raise cattle really well, but I can't raise corn very well because it's so hilly. And but on the other side of the mountain, there's a flat plain, and it's great for growing corn. And so I can give my beef to them, and they can give their corn to me. But that requires me to think spatially in a different way. My world is bigger than what I can experience literally. So in order to move to the mercantile age, we actually had to rewire our brains to be able to think a little more abstractly, a little more expansively, and to think not so just literally about space, but conceptually about the larger space I'm in. Another technological invention that was fundamental in that era was the clock. And again, hard for us to believe in the 21st century, but there was a period in the agricultural age where time really didn't matter. You didn't think, okay, in 2 hours I'm going to be doing this, and then this evening I'm going to do that, and then tomorrow I'm going to do this, and next week, and 3 weeks from now, and a month from now. And it wasn't so much about parsing your life into these temporal segments and then organizing how you do things according to those segments. You just lived your life in the moment on the farm. But to move to a mercantile age, they had to begin to think, okay, we're going to have market day on Saturday. And Saturday is going to be different than Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And market's going to be open from 7 o'clock in the morning until 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And so I've got to be there at those times in order to exchange my goods. And it began to require a different brain function, a different attitude toward time. So the invention of the map and the invention of the clock made our brains think about space and think about time in a completely different way. And it was that brain capability that enabled us to move into the mercantile age. Now, the same thing was true mercantile age to industrial age, and really fundamentally then it was about understanding numbers. In order to make these factories work, there had to be some engineering that went on. There had to be some calculation about manpower and when you needed it where and to do what, and payment and remuneration and profit. And so when you began to move into an industrial age, you needed to use numbers much more. And again, prior to that, the human brain really wasn't about numbers. We weren't about calculation. But as we moved into industrial age, a lot more people needed to get a lot more brain capability in numbers. Then moving from the industrial age to the organizational age, the huge difference that had to happen there was literacy. Our capability, our brain's capability to understand language and to understand words. Now, certainly oral communication was very, very common all through all of those ages, but actually written communication was not all that common. And up until the organizational age, everybody wasn't kind of required to be literate. So in most people's jobs, they didn't need to be able to read that memo or read that email or read that report or write that report. So the written language was not so much a part of everybody's job. But as we moved into the organizational age, we all had to up our game as human beings in terms of our ability to understand and communicate written language. And it meant that we had to have literacy, pretty much universal literacy, which didn't exist before. And again, in the 21st century, it's hard for us to imagine how hard it is to get an entire population literate. Learning to read is a hard thing, and especially if you didn't learn it when you were a tiny little kid, it's a super hard thing to do. The whole notion of letters going into words, words going into sentences, and then it's one thing to have reading when you read out loud and you understand that way. That's like oral communication, and it's not that different from what people have been doing. But to read silently, that was another capability, to be able to really ingest and get the full meaning of that material silently. That's another brain function. And then to be able to really do deep reading, which is another level of reading, where you actually put yourself vicariously into that space. That's yet another brain capability. And now that we have neuroscience and we can understand how the brain works better, all of these are very complicated things that require many, many neuronal connections in order to acquire those skills. But in order to move from a industrial age to an organizational age, we had to really increase our brain's capability in terms of how it understands and comprehends written communication. Now, that brings us to the more current situation. What are new brain functions that we have to acquire going from the organizational age to the creative age? And what are new demands we need to be placing on our brain, and what are new neuronal connections we need to be making in our brain in order to be well equipped for a creative age? So a question I really want us to think about is, in a creative age, what kind of brain do we need to be developing? And are there new technological inventions that are helping us to create a different kind of brain for the creative age than maybe the kind of brain that was required for an organizational age? So I would say there are several things that occur to me. And in our check-in, hopefully we can have some discussion of this. I'd like you to be thinking of What are new demands on your brain? What are new brain capabilities you think are required for a creative age? So, for example, I think in the last few decades, there's been an enormous change in the way our brain works in terms of how we interface with the digital world. The enormous increase in media and our ability to see and experience things through media. How does that change our brain? How does that give us options and possibilities and stimulation that wasn't possible before we had these digital devices? These days, we travel. We can travel so much more than people could even a couple of decades ago. So that experience of travel, of being able to go to New York or go to LA or go to San Francisco or go to Atlanta, or the ability to spend a few weeks in Europe or spend a semester in Japan or go to the Middle East, or these are things that are not uncommon among people in your generation, that would have been extremely uncommon for people in the organizational age. It would have been rare for somebody to have, I've been to Europe 3 times and I'm 22 years old. But that's not so unusual these days. That experience, that kind of stimulation is extremely useful in the creative age, but was kind of unavailable in previous eras. So what kind of brain are we making? And I would say it's a brain that has several capabilities that I think are super important. One capability is extrapolation, and the next talk is going to be about 10 new terms that we're going to be looking at in the class. And one of them is extrapolation, which is this notion to conjecture something, to see something that's not there, to expand beyond what is in front of you. And that ability to extrapolate, I think, is stimulated by some of these things that are available to us in the digital world and that actually shape our brain to be able to extrapolate in a way that people haven't needed to do before. Another thing I think has to do with collaboration. Again, in those 10 terms, 5 of them are going to be having to do with working with other people. And I think in a creative age, we're going to be emphasizing this a lot more in the second half than we did in the first half. It's not just about making yourself creative. It's about figuring out how to be creative with other people through collaboration or through teamwork or through other kinds of devices. And this is a classic creative age kind of capability. Can I brainstorm? Can I really mind meld with other people so that our brains are getting a bigger capability, a more expansive capability by getting out of ourselves individually? Now, the location we chose for this talk has everything to do with this piece of sculpture that's right here. This is a piece of sculpture by a very famous 20th century sculptor named Sol LeWitt. And Sol LeWitt was kind of the father of what's called conceptual art. This is a piece of art done in the creative age, and very, very different from a piece of art that might have been done in a previous era. In a previous era, we think of an artist as someone who, they paint something, they craft every single piece of it. They are completely in control of what that painting is, what that piece of art is. And its conceptual content and its execution are all done by one human being. And Sol LeWitt had this notion that no, in the creative age, we're going to think of art in a different way. And it's going to be very collaborative, and it's going to involve a whole team of people to do something. So I, as a part of this team, I have my role to play, but other people have other roles to play as well. So this particular piece of sculpture was actually commissioned by the city of New York for a park in Manhattan. And Sol LeWitt was selected as the artist to do this commission. And in the way he normally operated, he would do the conceptual part of the art, but then he would have a team of people who would do the execution of the art. And for him, very explicitly, The piece of art is the conceptual thing that I contribute here. So he created a set of instructions for how to make this piece of art. And it was made in New York City by a whole team of people who constructed it. Sol LeWitt never put a hand on any of that, because in a creative age, it's not just about one person. And then it turned out that that park was redesigned 30 years later, and they tore down the piece of sculpture. But the piece of art, those instructions, was still there. And a decade or so later, UT purchased that piece of art, which was a set of instructions. They brought it to the campus here, and they had a different team of people resurrect, reconstruct exactly what Sol LeWitt said to do. Now, this is considered very much a piece of Sol LeWitt sculpture, although physically this thing I'm sitting on was not constructed until Sol LeWitt was dead. But for him, the piece of art had to do with a team of people. He made his contribution, other people made other contributions. And he's very, very compulsive about, he lists all of those people. This piece of art is done by all of these people, and it's a collaborative effort. And that is a certain kind of brain capability, a way of thinking and a way of acting that is very, very different from making art in other periods. Now, inside the Gates Dell building behind me, there are 2 paintings by Sol LeWitt, exactly the same thing. Sol LeWitt made the instructions for those. They were actually executed by a team of people years after he died. But they're considered very much, those are Sol LeWitt paintings. This is a difference of the creative age, where it's not just about maybe one person, but creative work, like art, is something that's done collectively, collaboratively, by a team of people. So in the next talk, we're going to be looking at these 10 terms and exploring those ideas a little bit more. But it's all set in the context of us thinking about, how do we think about work? How do we think about creative acts? How do we think about the way our mind works and the way it interacts with other people's minds in a creative age? Okay, see you next time.